Every October for 31 years, a line of cars formed on rural Route 4 outside of Hendersonville, North Carolina, starting at the Jessup Farm Gate and stretching, on the best Saturdays, nearly 2 miles down the mountain road. They came for cider, not the pasteurized, filtered, shelf-stable juice that the grocery stores sold in gallon jugs with expiration dates and nutrition labels. They came for Jessup cider, raw, unfiltered, unpasteurized, pressed from apples that grew on trees older than the people drinking it, made on a press that was older still, and sold from a barn that smelled like a century of autumn. Glenn Jessup pressed that cider. He was 62 years old in 1997, the year the health department showed up, and he'd been pressing apples every October since he was 14, when his father, Virgil, had put him on the press for the first time and taught him the sound a good apple makes when the screw bites down, a wet, tearing crack, followed by the rush of juice hitting the collection tray. Virgil had learned from his father, Amos. Amos had learned from his father, Tobias, who'd built the press in 1891 from a white oak beam and a cast iron screw he'd ordered from a foundry in Asheville. 4 generations of Jessups. 106 years of pressing cider in the same barn, on the same press, from the same orchard. 200 apple trees on 12 acres of Blue Ridge mountainside. Varieties so old that some of them didn't have names anymore. They just had descriptions. The red one by the spring. The yellow one on the upper terrace. Grandpa's Spitter, a crabapple so tart it made your eyes water, but when blended with the sweet varieties, it produced a cider with a backbone that commercial operations couldn't touch. The customers knew this. The 2-mile line knew this. Families drove from Asheville, Greenville, Spartanburg, Knoxville, some from 3 hours away, because Jessup cider tasted like something that the modern food system had lost. It tasted like a specific place, a specific set of trees, a specific man's hands on a specific press. It tasted, people said, the way October is supposed to taste, and you couldn't get it anywhere else. Then on a Tuesday morning in September of 1997, a health inspector named Brenda Combs drove up the Jessup Farm Road, walked into the pressing barn, and shut the operation down. Let me tell you about what Brenda saw and what she didn't see, because the gap between those two things is the entire story. What Brenda saw: a wooden cider press built in 1891, a dirt floor, no refrigeration, no pasteurization equipment, no stainless steel surfaces, wooden collection trays, a hand-operated screw mechanism, apples stored in bushel baskets on the ground, cider bottled in recycled glass jugs with handwritten labels, no temperature monitoring, no bacterial testing, no HACCP plan, no processing license. What Brenda didn't see: a product with a perfect safety record going back 106 years, a pressing process that naturally controlled bacterial growth through acid content. Apple cider's pH of 3.3 to 3.5 is acidic enough to inhibit the growth of most pathogens, which is why people have been pressing and drinking raw cider safely for centuries. An orchard that used no pesticides, no fungicides, and no chemical treatments of any kind. The trees were too old for modern spray programs and too healthy from a century of natural soil biology to need them. Customers who returned every year because the cider was unlike anything produced in a licensed facility. Mr. Jessup, this facility doesn't meet state food processing standards. You're operating without a license. The press is wooden. It needs to be stainless steel or food-grade plastic. The floor is dirt. It needs to be sealed concrete. You have no pasteurization system. North Carolina requires that all cider sold to the public be pasteurized or treated with UV light to eliminate pathogens. You have no temperature monitoring, no bacterial testing, no written food safety plan. Brenda set her clipboard on the press, the same oak beam that Tobias Jessup had shaped with a draw knife in 1891, and read the list of violations. Estimated cost to bring this facility into compliance, $28,000 to $35,000. Until renovations are complete and the facility passes re-inspection, you are prohibited from selling cider. Glenn looked at the press. He looked at the collection tray. White oak, hand-carved by Amos in 1924, stained golden brown from 73 years of apple juice flowing across its surface. He looked at the barn, the same barn where 4 generations of Jessups had pressed apples every October, where the walls were dark with the sweet vinegar and honey smell of a century of cider making. He looked at Brenda Combs, who was 31 years old and had never pressed an apple in her life. The cider is safe, Glenn said. The regulation requires pasteurization. Unpasteurized cider can harbor E. coli, O157:H7, Cryptosporidium, and other pathogens. Several outbreaks nationally have been traced to unpasteurized apple cider. From commercial operations using windfall apples off the ground apples that have been contaminated by cattle or deer. My apples are picked from the tree, by hand. Everyone, no windfalls, no ground contact, no livestock in the orchard. The contamination risk doesn't exist here because the contamination pathway doesn't exist. The regulation doesn't distinguish between risk levels. The regulation requires pasteurization for all cider sold to the public. The regulation was written for factories. This is a barn. The regulation is the regulation, Mr. Jessup. Brenda posted the violation notice on the barn door and drove away. Glenn stood in the pressing barn and looked at the 200 bushels of apples, already picked and waiting for the press. 2 weeks of harvest, carried down the mountain in baskets on his Farmall Super M, sorted by variety on the barn floor, ready for the pressing season that had just been canceled. For the first time in 106 years, there would be no Jessup cider in October. Let me tell you about the orchard. Because the trees are the reason the cider was worth a 2-mile line, and the trees are what the regulation couldn't account for. The Jessup orchard was planted between 1882 and 1910 by Tobias Jessup and his son Amos. The varieties were Appalachian heritage apples, not the Red Delicious and Gala and Fuji that the grocery stores sold, but the old mountain varieties that had been bred over centuries for flavor, keeping quality, and cider character. Virginia Winesap, Albemarle Pippin, Arkansas Black, Grimes Golden, Newtown Pippin, Limber Twigs, Horse Apples, and at least a dozen varieties that had no commercial name. Seedling trees that Tobias had grafted from wild apples he'd found growing in the coves and hollows of the Blue Ridge, selected because they produced a juice that balanced sweet, tart, bitter, and aromatic in ways that no single variety could achieve alone. The orchard was Glenn's blending palate. Each variety contributed something different to the cider. The Winesaps provided body and depth. The Pippins provided acidity and brightness. The Arkansas Blacks, dark, almost purple apples that didn't ripen until late October, provided tannin and complexity. The wild seedlings provided the indefinable something, the flavor that people couldn't describe except to say it tasted like the mountain, because it was the mountain. The trees were growing in Blue Ridge soil, fed by Blue Ridge rain, shaped by Blue Ridge seasons, and producing fruit that contained the mineral character of the specific granite and gneiss and mica that lay under those 12 acres. Terroir, the French word for what the mountain put in the apple, and the apple put in the cider. Glen's blending method was his grandfather's. Amos had taught Virgil, Virgil had taught Glen. The blend changed every year because the harvest changed every year. A dry summer produced smaller, more concentrated apples with higher sugar and deeper flavor. A wet summer produced larger, juicier apples with more acid and less complexity. Glen adjusted the blend to the season, tasting as he pressed, adding more wine sap in a thin year, more pippin in a flat year, always including the Arkansas blacks for structure and the wild seedlings for character. The result was a cider that was never the same twice, but always identifiably Jessup. The way a vineyard's wine changes with the vintage, but always tastes like that vineyard. The customers understood this. The regulars, the families who'd been coming for decades, who'd grown up drinking Jessup cider and brought their children to drink it too. They didn't come for consistency. They came for authenticity, for the taste of a specific place made by a specific family on a specific piece of mountain. Pasteurization would kill it. Not literally. The heat treatment that the health department required would technically produce a safe, shelf-stable product. But pasteurization at 160 degrees for 6 seconds destroys the volatile aromatic compounds that give raw cider its complexity. The subtle flavors, the floral notes from the pippins, the spice from the Arkansas blacks, the wild mountain character from the seedling trees, are heat-sensitive. They evaporate at exactly the temperatures the regulations require. What remains after pasteurization is safe. It's also flat, one-dimensional, and indistinguishable from any other pasteurized cider in any other grocery store in America. Glen knew this because he'd tried it. In 1993, when the first rumors of pasteurization requirements began circulating through the North Carolina cider community, Glen had pasteurized a batch as a test. He tasted the raw press beside the pasteurized version and nearly wept. The pasteurized cider tasted like warm apple juice. The raw cider tasted like his orchard. The difference was the difference between a photograph and the actual view. One was a record of the thing. The other was the thing itself. "If I pasteurize this cider," Glen told his wife Martha, "it stops being Jessup cider. It becomes apple juice with a Jessup label. The press, the orchard, the blend, the 106 years. None of it matters if you kill the flavor at the last step." Let me tell you about the 2 years between the shutdown and the resurrection. Because what happened is a story about a community that refused to let a regulation destroy something irreplaceable. The shutdown hit the Jessup farm hard. Cider sales had been generating $12,000 to $18,000 per season. 3 weeks of pressing in October, sold at the barn gate at $4 per gallon. That income was 40% of the farm's annual revenue. Without it, Glen was farming 120 acres of hay and cattle on income that barely covered expenses. The farm all Super M needed a clutch rebuild. The barn roof needed patching. Martha needed a dental procedure they'd been postponing. The $12,000 from cider season was the money that paid for everything the farm income couldn't reach. The 200 bushels of picked apples went unpressed. Glenn couldn't sell the cider, and he couldn't sell the apples. They were heritage varieties, too small, too ugly, too varied for the commercial market. The grocery stores wanted uniform, red delicious, and gala, not gnarly limber twigs and spotted Arkansas blacks. The apples sat in the barn for a week. Then Glenn hauled them to the compost pile and dumped them. 2 weeks of harvest, $12,000 in potential cider, rotting in a pile behind the barn. The customers noticed. Of course they noticed. October came and the line didn't form. The barn was dark. The press was silent. The people who'd been driving to the Jessup farm every fall, some of them for 30 years, called the house. Martha answered, "The health department shut us down. We can't sell cider." The reaction was immediate and furious. Not at Glenn, but at the regulation. Letters arrived at the Henderson County Health Department. Phone calls flooded the office. A petition circulated through Hendersonville, Asheville, and the surrounding mountain communities. Within a month, over 800 people had signed a petition asking the health department to grant an exemption for the Jessup cider operation. The health department declined. The regulation was state level, not county. Brenda Combs had been enforcing the law, not making it. The exemption would have to come from Raleigh, from the state legislature, through a process that could take years. But the petition did something else. It attracted attention. A food writer for the Asheville Citizen-Times named David Oakley picked up the story and wrote a feature in November of 1997. The headline was, "Last Press, a century-old cider operation silenced by modern regulations." The article described the orchard, the press, the 4 generations, the blend, the 2-mile line, and the shutdown. It quoted Glenn. "The regulation was written for factories. This is a barn. The cider has been safe for 106 years. Nobody got sick. The press never hurt anyone. The health department didn't shut down a safety hazard. They shut down a tradition." The article went regional. The Charlotte Observer picked it up. The Raleigh News and Observer ran a shortened version. A food magazine in Atlanta reprinted it. Within 2 months, the Jessup cider story had reached readers across 5 states: North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Virginia. People who'd never heard of Jessup cider were suddenly aware that it existed, that it was extraordinary, and that the government had killed it. That awareness would matter. But first, Glenn had to find a way back into business. Let me tell you about the legal pathway, because it involved a loophole, a lawyer, and a state legislator who'd been drinking Jessup cider since he was 12. Glenn couldn't afford a lawyer. He had $3,400 in savings after the lost cider season. Lawyers in Asheville wanted $200 an hour. But one of Glenn's customers, a woman named Patricia Holt, who drove from Asheville every October with her 3 children and a collection of glass jugs, was married to a food law attorney named Reed Holt, who specialized in agricultural exemptions. Reed offered to work pro bono. "I've been drinking your cider for 15 years, Reed told Glenn. "If the state shuts you down permanently, I lose my October tradition. I'm not billing you, I'm protecting my supply." Reed identified 2 possible pathways. The first was an agricultural exemption. North Carolina law allowed certain farm products to be sold directly to consumers without full processing facility compliance. provided the product was produced on the farm, sold on the farm, and the consumer was informed that the product was not processed in a licensed facility. The exemption had been designed for things like raw honey, farm gate eggs, and small batch preserves. Reed argued it could apply to raw cider. The second pathway was a legislative fix. State Representative Howard Baines, who represented Henderson County, and who had, as it happened, been buying Jessup cider since 1985, introduced a bill in the 1998 legislative session. The bill proposed an exemption for small-scale cider operations, defined as pressing fewer than 5,000 gallons per year, selling directly to consumers at the farm gate, from the pasteurization requirement, provided the product was labeled as unpasteurized, and the operation met basic sanitation standards. The bill was opposed by the North Carolina Department of Health. It was opposed by the commercial cider industry, two large operations in the western part of the state that had invested in pasteurization equipment and didn't want small competitors selling raw cider without the same costs. It was opposed by the Food Safety Establishment, which argued that any raw cider, regardless of source, posed a public health risk. It was supported by 800 petition signatures, a food writer at the Asheville Citizen-Times, a food law attorney working for free, and a state representative who wanted his cider back. The bill passed in June of 1999. The vote was 74 to 38. The exemption was narrow, fewer than 5,000 gallons, farm gate sales only, mandatory unpasteurized labeling, annual sanitation inspection. But it was enough. Glenn could press cider again. He pressed the first batch in October of 1999, 2 years after the shutdown. The same press, the same orchard, the same barn, the same blend, winesap, pippin, Arkansas black, and the wild seedlings that tasted like the mountain. The line formed at dawn, not the usual 2-mile Saturday line. This time it was 3 miles. The newspaper articles had done what the health department couldn't. They'd made Jessup cider famous. People who'd never heard of it before 1997 had been reading about it for 2 years, building anticipation, planning their October trip to Henderson County to taste the cider that the government had tried to kill. Glenn pressed 400 gallons the first Saturday, sold out by 11 a.m. He pressed 600 the second Saturday, sold out by noon. By the end of October, he'd pressed and sold 3,200 gallons, the largest season in the history of the operation. At $5 per gallon, he'd raised the price $1 after the 2-year absence. That was $16,000, more than he'd ever made in a single season. Let me tell you about what happened when the cider world found out, because a 106-year-old cider operation that had survived a government shutdown was exactly the kind of story that the emerging craft cider movement was starving for. In 2000, a cider maker from Vermont named Tom Burford, one of the founding voices of the American craft cider revival, read the Asheville Citizen-Times article in a collection of reprints that a colleague had mailed him. Burford was a pomologist, a specialist in historic apple varieties, and the description of the Jessup orchard set his blood on fire. Virginia winesap, Albemarle pippin, Arkansas black. Unnamed seedling varieties from the coves of the Blue Ridge, trees planted between 1882 and 1910. A blending tradition passed through 4 generations. Burford drove from Virginia to Henderson County in April of 2001, not cider season, But apple blossom season, he wanted to see the trees. He spent 3 days walking the orchard with Glenn, examining every tree, identifying varieties by bark, leaf, and blossom structure. He found what he'd hoped to find and more. The Jessup orchard contained at least 8 varieties that were no longer grown commercially in the United States. 3 of the unnamed seedling trees appeared to be unique. Genetic individuals that existed nowhere else on Earth. The offspring of chance pollination between heritage varieties and Blue Ridge wild apples that had never been identified or cataloged. Mr. Jessup, your orchard is a genetic museum, Burford told Glenn. These trees, the unnamed ones, the ones your great-grandfather grafted from the wild, they're irreplaceable. They don't exist anywhere else. If these trees die, those genetics are gone forever. They won't die. I've been grafting replacements since 1975. Every tree in this orchard has a young graft growing somewhere on the property. When an old tree goes, the replacement is ready. You've been propagating your own rootstock for 25 years? My father taught me. He said the orchard is the press's pantry. If the pantry's empty, the press is useless. You have to keep the pantry stocked. Burford wrote about the Jessup orchard in his book on American cider apples, published in 2003. The chapter on Appalachian heritage orchards devoted 4 pages to the Jessup operation. The varieties, the blending method, the press, the 4-generation tradition, the shutdown, and the legislative fight. He called the Jessup orchard one of the most significant living collections of heritage cider apples in the eastern United States. The book was read by every craft cider maker in America, and the phone at the Jessup farm started ringing with a different kind of call. Not customers wanting to buy cider, but cider makers wanting to buy scion wood, grafting material, cuttings from Glenn's heritage trees that could be grafted onto rootstock and grown into new trees in orchards across the country. Glenn sold scion wood for $5 per cutting, 10 to 12 inches of dormant branch wood, shipped in damp paper during the winter grafting season. The income was modest, $2,000 to $3,000 per year. But the significance was enormous. Jessup genetics, the unnamed Blue Ridge seedlings, the limber twigs, the ancient wine saps, began appearing in craft cider orchards from Vermont to Oregon. The orchard that the health department had tried to shut down was seeding the American cider revival. Let me tell you about Brenda Combs, because the health inspector who posted the violation notice in 1997 came back in 2002, and the visit was nothing like the first one. Brenda was now 36. She'd been promoted to senior inspector for Henderson County. In the 5 years since the shutdown, she'd watched the Jessup story unfold from a distance. The newspaper articles, the petition, the legislative fight, the reopening, the 3-mile line, the pomologist from Vermont, the book chapter. She'd enforced the regulation correctly. She'd followed the code. She'd done her job. And the things she'd shut down had become more famous than anything else the health department had ever touched. She drove to the Jessup farm on a Thursday afternoon in October of 2002, not for an inspection. The new exemption had transferred oversight to the agricultural department, which sent its own inspector every spring. Brenda came because she needed to understand something that the code hadn't prepared her for. She found Glenn in the pressing barn. It was mid-season. Apples in baskets on the floor. the press loaded with a batch of wine saps and pippins, cider running golden brown from the press into the collection tray, filling the barn with the scent of 100 autumns compressed into one Saturday morning. "Mr. Jessup, Miss Combs, I'm not here to inspect. I know, the Ag Department handles that now. I'm here to—" Brenda stopped. She was a government employee standing in a barn she'd shut down 5 years earlier, watching a man operate the same wooden press she'd condemned, pressing the same unwashed, unpasteurized, unregulated cider that she'd declared a health hazard. And the barn was alive with customers, a line of people stretching out the door and down the farm road, each one carrying glass jugs, each one waiting to buy the things she'd tried to eliminate. "I'm here to taste the cider." Glenn looked at her. Then he picked up a paper cup, held it under the press tray, and let it fill with fresh cider. Still cloudy, still cold from the morning air, still 3 minutes from the apple. He handed it to her. Brenda drank it, standing in the barn. The cider hit her palate the way it hit everyone's. The wine sap depth first, then the pippin brightness, then the wild mountain character that nobody could name but everyone could taste. The complexity, the layers, the thing that pasteurization would have killed and that 106 years of tradition had kept alive. "This is not what I expected," Brenda said. "What did you expect?" "Apple juice. Sweet. Simple. One note." "That's what pasteurized cider tastes like. One note. This is 20 notes. One for every variety in the orchard, layered by the blend, preserved by the cold and the acid. The pH of this cider is 3.4. At that acidity, E. coli dies within 24 hours. Cryptosporidium can't survive below pH 3.5. The cider protects itself. The apples protect the cider. The orchard protects the apples. The system has been working since my great-grandfather built this press. The regulation didn't account for any of that. The regulation was written for factories pressing commodity apples, windfalls, ground contact fruit, fruit from orchards where cattle graze. The contamination risk from ground apples is real. I've never disputed that. But my apples are picked from the tree, by hand. Everyone. The risk pathway that the regulation addresses doesn't exist in this barn. I know that now. I didn't know it in 1997. You didn't ask. You measured the building and the equipment and the process against a code that was written for a different operation at a different scale. You didn't taste the cider. You didn't walk the orchard. You didn't ask why 800 people signed a petition to keep it open. I was doing my job. You were doing a job that didn't fit. The same code that keeps a 1,000,000-gallon factory safe almost killed a 3,000-gallon barn operation that's been safe for a century. The code can't tell the difference. That's not your fault. It's the code's limitation. Brenda looked at the press. The white oak beam, darkened with age, the cast iron screw worn smooth by 100 years of turning. The collection tray, stained golden from 78 years of juice. The barn walls, dark with the sweet acetone smell of fermented apple residue that had been accumulating since Tobias Jessup first pressed fruit in 1891. I shut this down because the press was wooden. The code requires stainless steel or food-grade plastic, but the wood... She ran her hand along the press beam. The wood is part of the flavor, isn't it? The oak contributes tannin, trace amounts. It's the same principle as aging wine in oak barrels. The wood interacts with the liquid. A stainless steel press makes clean cider. A wooden press makes cider with character. My great-grandfather chose white oak for the press because he'd tasted cider from oak presses in the mountains and from tin presses at the general store and knew the difference. The code would require you to replace a 106-year-old oak press with stainless steel. And the cider would lose the oak character, and the customers would taste the difference, and the 2-mile line would become a quarter-mile line, and eventually it would become no line at all, because without the oak, without the heritage apples, without the raw process, this cider's just apple juice, and nobody drives 2 hours for apple juice. Brenda finished her cup. She set it on the press beam, gently, the way you set something down on a surface you've learned to respect. I owe you an apology. I cost you 2 years of income. I cost your customers 2 seasons of cider. I nearly cost this community a tradition that's been here since before the health department existed. You enforced the code. The code was wrong for this situation. The apology belongs to the code, not to you. The code doesn't apologize. No, it doesn't. But the legislature amended it. That's the code's version of admitting it was wrong. Let me tell you about the JD dealer, because Roy Kershaw enters this story the same way every dealer enters, with the assumption that anything not producing a crop in a row is a waste of acreage. Roy ran the John Deere franchise in Hendersonville. He'd been selling equipment in Henderson County for 18 years and had long considered the Jessup farm a case study in missed potential. Glenn farmed 120 acres of hay and cattle with a 1957 Farmall Super M and a 1950 Farmall H. He maintained 12 acres of apple trees that produced fruit too ugly for the commercial market. He pressed cider on a wooden press from 1891 and sold it from a barn. Glenn Jessup is farming a museum, Roy told the men at the feed store. He's got 120 acres of hay ground that could be corn if he'd buy a planter. He's got 12 acres of apple trees that are older than his tractor. He presses cider on a piece of furniture. The man is allergic to the 20th century. When the shutdown happened in 1997, Roy considered it inevitable. The government finally caught up with him. You can't sell food from a dirt floor barn with no license. The health department did what any reasonable agency would do. When the cider became famous, the newspaper articles, the 3-mile line, the pomologist from Vermont, the legislative exemption, Roy drove to the Jessup farm for the first time in a decade. He found Glenn in the orchard, grafting a scion from an unnamed seedling onto a young rootstock. Glenn. Roy. I read the book, the one by the apple man from Vermont, Burford. He called your orchard one of the most significant living collections of heritage cider apples in the eastern United States. That's what he said. I called it 12 acres of old trees. You did. I was wrong. Those 12 acres are worth more per square foot than any cornfield in Henderson County. Not because of the fruit, because of the genetics. The scion wood you're selling, the orchard itself, the tradition. You can't buy that at any price. You can buy corn seed anywhere. You can't buy a 120-year-old Arkansas black anywhere. It only exists here. My great-grandfather planted it in 1888, 114 years ago. And you're grafting replacements to make sure it's still here in another 114. Roy looked at the graft Glenn was tying.
Fresh scion wood bound to rootstock with rubber strips sealed with wax.
The ancient art of cloning a tree by hand. I've been selling tractors for 18 years. Tractors are machines. They wear out in 15 years and you buy a new one. Those trees. Roy gestured at the orchard. Those trees have been working for over a century and they're still producing. No depreciation, no payments, no trade-in. Trees don't depreciate, Roy. They compound. Every year the root system grows deeper. Every year the canopy produces more fruit. Every year the flavor gets more complex because the roots reach further into the mountain. The trees my great-grandfather planted are better now than the day he planted them. Name me a John Deere that gets better with age. Roy couldn't. Let me tell you about the fame, because between 2001 and 2005, Jessup cider went from a local tradition to a regional legend. The combination of the shutdown story, the Burford book, the legislative fight, and the craft cider revival turned Jessup cider into something larger than a farm product. It became a symbol, proof that small-scale traditional food production could survive the regulatory machine, that flavor could outlast bureaucracy, that a wooden press from 1891 could produce something that a $1 million processing plant couldn't replicate. The Asheville food scene, which by the early 2000s was becoming one of the most vibrant in the Southeast, embraced Jessup cider as a flagship local product. 3 restaurants in Asheville featured it on their menus during October. A cocktail bar created a Jessup toddy that became the most popular fall drink in the city. A food photographer from Atlanta drove to the farm and shot a series of images. The press, the apples, Glenn's hands, the golden cider running from the oak tray, that appeared in Garden and Gun magazine in 2003. The Garden and Gun feature was the tipping point. The magazine's readership, affluent, food-conscious, Southern, descended on Henderson County that October like a well-dressed invasion. The line went from 3 miles to 4. Glenn pressed 4,800 gallons that season, the maximum his orchard could produce without stripping the trees. At $6 per gallon, he'd raised the price again. That was $28,800 in cider revenue. More than his cattle and hay combined. More than the farm had ever earned in a single year from any source. The John Deere dealer's cornfield comparison was dead. 12 acres of heritage apple trees were out earning 120 acres of hay. By 2005, the waiting list for Jessup Cyanwood was 2 years long. Cider makers in 6 states were growing trees from Jessup genetics. The unnamed Blue Ridge seedlings, Grandpa's Spitter, the red one by the spring, the yellow one on the upper terrace, had been given formal cultivar names by the North Carolina Cooperative Extension, documented, cataloged, and preserved in the state's heritage fruit collection. The trees that Tobias Jessup had grafted from wild apples in the 1880s were now part of the permanent agricultural record of the state of North Carolina. The health department that had shut the operation down had inadvertently created the publicity that made it famous. The shutdown was the inciting incident. The newspaper article was the catalyst. The legislative fight was the drama. And the cider, the unchanged, unpasteurized, uncompromised cider, was the product that proved it was all worth fighting for. Let me tell you how this ends. Glenn Jessup pressed cider every October until 2008, when he was 73. His daughter Anne took over the operation. She presses on the same 1891 press, in the same barn, from the same orchard. The trees Glenn grafted in the 1970s and 80s are now producing fruit alongside the original trees Tobias planted in the 1880s. The blend has shifted. Newer trees contribute different character than the oldest ones, but the method is the same. Pick by hand, sort by variety, press on oak, blend by taste, sell from the barn. The Farmall Super M is in the barn. Ann's husband uses it to haul apples from the orchard in October. The same job the tractor has done since Virgil bought it in 1957. It's 67 years old. It starts on the second crank. The line still forms. Not as long as the peak years. The craft cider market has matured, and there are now 23 small cider operations in western North Carolina, where there were 3 in 1997. But the Jessup line is still the longest, still starts at dawn, still stretches more than a mile on the best Saturdays, because the people who come aren't coming for cider. They're coming for the specific cider that comes from the specific trees on the specific mountain, pressed on the specific oak press that Tobias Jessup built in 1891. Brenda Combs retired from the health department in 2010. She drives to the Jessup farm every October and stands in line like everyone else. She buys 2 gallons. She drinks 1 in October and saves 1 for Thanksgiving. She tells her grandchildren that she once shut the operation down and that it was the most instructive mistake of her career. I measured the building, she tells them. I should have measured the cider. Let me ask you something. What are you measuring? Brenda Combs measured the press, the floor, the walls, and the process. She measured everything that could be quantified on a clipboard, every dimension, every surface, every deviation from the code. And by her measurements, the operation was a failure. Every checkbox was wrong. Every standard was unmet. Every regulation was violated. But the cider was extraordinary. The orchard was irreplaceable. The tradition was 106 years deep. The customers lined up for miles. The flavor was unlike anything produced in a facility that would have passed inspection. And the thing that the code couldn't measure, the taste, was the only thing that mattered. The health department measured the container. The customers measured the contents. The container failed. The contents became the most famous cider in 5 states. Sometimes the thing that doesn't meet the standard is the thing that sets the standard. And the man who keeps making it on the same press from the same trees in the same barn, despite every clipboard and every code, is the man who understands that some things can't be measured by regulation. They can only be measured by the people who taste them. The health department shut down his cider press. 2 years later, it was the most famous cider in 5 states. Because the press wasn't the problem. The press was the answer. And it had been the answer since 1891.